Now, before I reveal what my top 10 films of 2025 are, I need to start by saying that this year has been the worst I've ever experienced for cinema. Usually, when you're putting together a top 10 list, you're picking works that have been notable contributions to the art form that year. But I've been forced into a position where I'm picking films that were just good, but by no means significant contributions to cinema. And only one film blew me away this year. Just one. But before I reveal what that film is, I want to give an honourable mention to a film that didn't deserve to make the top 10 list and was by no means fantastic, but it's worth a mention because of its ability to be interesting. There's a lot of films that are released that aren't perfect, but they're very interesting. In 2024, I gave my honourable mention to Joker Folie à Deux, but this year I'm going to give it to Ari Aster's Eddington. This is the guy who brought us Hereditary and Midsommar, but this isn't a horror film, but more of a dark satire as we revisit the year of 2020 where we lived through the time of COVID and Black Lives Matter. The film got a lot of negative criticism on its release, and I suspect that's because of frustrations that some felt that the film didn't pick a side during that period. But if you pull yourself out from the culture war battleground, what you'll find is it isn't a film about picking a side or delivering a moral lecture, but rather showing a portrait of a country that's headed towards a dark future. Now, because of this element, I think Eddington will be a film that gets revisited in years to come because of its ability to capture an early chapter in history that possibly warned us about the dark trajectory we're going down, where we, I believe, lead to this very bad point in the culture we find ourselves in now. And that's quite pessimistic, but the film also has a pessimistic outlook on the future. But now to get into the top 10. And at number 10 is a film called Companion. Now, this was somewhat of a pleasant surprise. It's a film that you don't go into with high expectations. The trailer at the time, it didn't display anything special. It just looked like your standard mainstream cinematic release that wouldn't have the ability to generate sequels, wouldn't have the ability to generate a large audience. But what it does do is it uses what I call the plot switch, which you witnessed in films such as Barbarian and Strange Darling, where the first 15-20 minutes of a film, it's not particularly interesting. And then when you get through that first quarter, the plot switches and it turns into something else. The story goes in a different direction to what you were expecting. And the direction that it travels in is usually a much better trajectory than the one we were going down before, as the film was originally presented to us. And if you've seen Barbarian and Strange Darling, you'll know what I mean. But it's not like From Dusk Till Dawn, where in the middle of the film, it changes into a different direction, a different genre. These films don't change their genre. They just change the direction of the plot into an area that you didn't expect it to go into. And if I was to reveal the plot to you now, it would ruin it for you, which is why these particular films are best going into blind. And at number 9, we have a film called Dreams, which is written and directed by Michael Franco, and it stars Jessica Chastain. So she plays a character from a wealthy family in America, and she's engaged in a twisted relationship with a Mexican immigrant who performs ballet at a dance academy that is funded by her family. I won't get too much into why this relationship is twisted, because it would reveal what occurs later in the story. But what I will say is that the film is very interesting, how it refrains from allowing ideology to drive the story, but instead letting the characters do so. The author, Lionel Shriver, who wrote the book We Need to Talk About Kevin, which was then adapted into a film by Lynn Ramsey, she said in a podcast a couple of years ago that stories are always rigged to prefer the immigrant and that they'll always be the winning character. And the setup and direction of the plot of this film, you suspect that's where you'll be led to, but instead the film manages to remove the tendency to conclude the story in what could be considered as politically correct, and instead it allows the characters to emotionally respond to events in a manner that feels authentic to their individual situations. This isn't a film where we're presented with a character who's the good guy and a character who's the bad guy. Instead, it's a film that shows every human's ability to become a monster. And we've been living in a time where storytelling is driven by ideological messaging. However, the most interesting films are those when the characters are in the driving seat of the story, rather than an activist writing a screenplay or standing behind a camera. At number 8 is Weapons, which was the new film by the guy who gave us Barbarian, Zach Cregger. I went into this with very high expectations. The setup was fantastic. It's a mystery about a bunch of children who go missing as they all run out of their houses at 2 a.m. and no one knows where they've went. There's a couple of moments in the film that are genuinely frightening. The film's very creative in terms of its direction of travel. The setup and marketing surrounding the film allowed the imagination to roam about why these children all left the houses at 2 a.m. in the morning, but the revelation was somewhat disappointing. I was listening to Zach Cregger get interviewed on a podcast called Script Apart, and he talked about the influence David Lynch's book Catching the Big Fish had on his creative approach. And it encourages allowing your subconscious to lead the story, embracing mystery and intuition, and letting ideas come from deeper, less rational places, and trusting where they lead rather than over-planning everything. And in the film, you can see what a big influence that creative approach had on him because of the direction of travel of the story that we were led on. And it took us to some interesting places, but it also took us to some bizarre places, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but my problem with it was some of the areas in which we were led to, it didn't feel as though there was logic to justify where we ended up going with the story. And by the way, films aren't obliged to neatly wrap up everything that's presented in the narrative. There's a strength in allowing the audience's imagination to take hold when they leave the cinema, as they wonder about the true origins that might explain some of the events that happened in the film, or even invent conclusions for themselves of certain elements that weren't tied up neatly. But I think in order for your audience to do that, for it to be a satisfactory experience with their imagination, you need to provide enough logic to what's happened in the film. And at number 7, we have The Naked Gun. Now, when this was announced, I was quite excited because I love Liam Neeson. I actually see the funny side behind him. I saw his ability to be funny in the Taken series, and now they're films that aren't meant to be amusing at all. I mean, the first film is very serious, but there is an element of amusement in Neeson's performance, playing this badass old guy hell-bent on revenge. And it ended up being a genre for him as he went on to play basically the same character pretty much in other films such as Non-Stop, The Commuter, The Ice Road, Cold Pursuit, what I call the Liam Neeson action film. So I was looking forward to this because this was Liam Neeson where he was actually in a film that was meant to be funny. And I haven't laughed at a film in quite a while, and many others reported the same reaction, but perhaps gave it a little too much praise, as the truth is, if this was released over a decade ago, it wouldn't have caused much of a storm. But because we've been living in a time where we've been told not to laugh at comedy that some may find offensive or inappropriate, when something like this comes along in 2025, it's as if we think it's fresh and brand new and something to be hailed, when really we've just been starved. And it probably feels like someone who's been brutally starved in some kind of concentration camp and given a piece of bread as their first thing to eat after days, and the prisoner thinks it's incredible, but really it's just a piece of bread. And that's what it felt like in the culture we find ourselves in now. But I had a lot of fun with it. It deserves a place in the top 10 during this year, in a year that wasn't really fun. At number 6 is a film called Lurker, which is about a lonely guy who manages to insert himself in the inner circle of a singer he admires, but his desperation to get closer to the star results in him being pushed away, and he then resorts to twisted measures to ensure he doesn't go back to his mundane life prior to entering the world of fame. Now, this was a film that was difficult to watch because it exposes a dark truth about reality that no one wants to acknowledge, and I won't get into what that is, as it's the conclusion of the film, but the entry into the kind of world this guy desperately wants to remain in isn't as glamorous as outsiders suspect it is. The film has a good original soundtrack. It can be very hit and miss when a film tries to create original music for a character who's a pop star, and we're supposed to believe that them songs are hits, but this film succeeds. It's believable. The film's directed and written by a guy called Alex Russell, who was behind a TV series called The Bear. I haven't seen it, but I'd be curious to check it out after seeing this film, and I'd be interested in what this guy explores next. At number 5, we have 28 Years Later, which is the long-awaited sequel to 28 Days Later, with Danny Boyle back in the director's seat and Alex Garland back writing the screenplay. I don't think many people were asking for this sequel, but there was a satisfying re-emergence of this series as it provided a nostalgic element to the 2000s, where that was the last decade where cinema was thriving. And it was also a very good example of the heights of what British cinema is capable of. I've always said that this nation's catalogue of film history doesn't do justice up against the French or the Americans, but this country has always had potential, and it's had a couple of greats, but not too many. And 28 years later isn't a great film. It's a good film, but the majority of British cinema is not impressive. This was impressive in the sense that it had a strong identity. It really took advantage of the element of identity and weaved it in to the story. It takes place in the northeast of England, which is where I'm originally from, and there's some strong regional accents in the film. This film was very successful in America and Europe. I'm not sure how easy the regional accent is for folk in them parts of the world to understand, but it didn't seem to be an issue. And you've also got a very competent story to go with it. My only criticism of that is it doesn't provide anything too meaningful. I wouldn't say you're deeply emotionally involved with any of the characters. Some people have found the film emotional. I didn't. But the story isn't anything to scream about. Interestingly, at the end, it sets up what the sequel will be. And again, I won't ruin this. I'd be surprised if you don't know what it is by now, but it sets up some very provocative waters that the second film will tread in, which I'm all for because provocative cinema is my bread and butter, but it was slightly frustrating seeing a film embrace that, and the audiences that we've had to endure over the past 10 years who have had problems with morality and ethics and whether certain aspects that storytellers dive into are appropriate. That crowd, they didn't seem to have a problem with this, and they shouldn't. But the point is, these are the people who have moaned and cried and created an atmosphere in which artists feel they need to remain in a safety net. Hopefully we're coming out of that now. But hey. At number 4 we have a film called Sirat, which is the most disturbing film of the year. It made me feel very uneasy. It feels like you're trapped in hell when watching it. And that sounds like a bad thing, but it's a good thing, in my view, that cinema has the power to provoke a huge sense of discomfort within you just from watching a series of images on a screen and hearing sounds. The film is about a father and his son who trek into the remote Moroccan desert and join a group of hippies who are travelling to a rave as they search for his missing daughter. And very bad things happen on this journey, which I won't get into, otherwise it would ruin the element of surprise and the ability to be disturbed. But it's a film I probably couldn't bring myself to watch again. Once you see it, you probably don't need to watch it again. But it was impressive filmmaking and, as I said, a great example of uncomfortable cinema. At number 3 we have Begonia, which was the new film by Yorgos Lanthimos this year, and I think he's reached the point where he's been able to incorporate his signature arts house style that some people may regard as disturbing, while also trying to satisfy a mainstream audience. I think he's truly found his sweet spot with this one. The film was well received from what I saw. It focuses on two men who kidnap a woman who is a well-known CEO as they are convinced she's an alien. This film really highlighted Emma Stone's comedy talents. She's hilarious. I came away even more convinced that she's a great comedy actress, and that's her true DNA when it comes to performance, I think. Begonia isn't Lanthimos's best film, but it certainly wasn't a bad film, and it was an enjoyable ride. But, and it's a big but, this film really shouldn't be this high in the top 10 list. It's a good film, but by no means should it chart in a position that you'd consider an outstanding piece of cinema to fall into. But we've got to work with what we were presented with this year. Just don't go into grand expectations based on the ranking in this list. At number 2, we have a film called Black Bag, which was the new entry by Steven Soderbergh, teaming up with his screenwriter David Koepp, who he worked with on the horror film Presence. But with this, we were rewarded with a smart British spy thriller. Michael Fassbender is a spy who is told that the traitor he is seeking is his wife, played by Cate Blanchett. It's a very intelligent film with sharp and witty dialogue, but it also displays the masterful craft of Soderbergh's direction. Every scene is directed with precision, transforming the most basic visual storytelling, such as cooking a meal, into something worth paying attention to. And there's a purpose behind everything that this guy conducts. There may have been a point in the plot where you're not necessarily understanding what's going on because it gets a bit complex. However, that complexity vanishes when you're thrust back into the drama between the characters, which is really the central key of enjoyment here, I think. Now, while this film is perfectly satisfying, it's by far a work that stands out as something to get excited about. Even if it is the second best film of 2025, British cinema still has a long way to go to persuade audiences that it matches the same calibre as America and France. But Soderbergh and Koepp at least contribute a work that demonstrates that it can make good resources available within the nation, a bit like 28 years later. However, Black Bag is a more concise film when it comes to its quality. There's not many faults with this. It's just not something that people will be talking about in years to come. At number 1, it was the best film at Venice Film Festival and also the best film of the year, and it's the morally complex and divisive After the Hunt. Now, some of you may be surprised as why this is ranked so highly in my list, given the slaughter of criticism it received, but the negative reaction to the film wasn't so much to do with the artistic elements, but rather the themes and conversations the film was engaging with, which seemed forbidden in cinema in the last 10 years. We've been living through a time where art hasn't been very daring. Filmmakers have played it too safe during a culture that seeks to eliminate the element of offence or embrace controversial conversations. But I was pleasantly surprised that screenwriter Nora Garrett and director Luca Guadagnino had the courage to tell a story that explored controversial waters and took the risk of upsetting the crowd that calls itself the cinema community. It's a story about a philosophy professor at Yale, played by Julia Roberts, who displays a cold reaction to one of her female students when she tells her that she's been sexually assaulted by another teacher, that being Andrew Garfield. But it turns out that Julia Roberts' character is carrying a dark secret that is slowly revealed as she tackles being stuck between being a supportive professor and a friend of a colleague who's been accused of a crime. The philosophical environment this story takes place in is fascinating, as it uses the art of conversation to tackle subject matters that, especially in a university setting, have been presented as settled. Yet the film unravels that, and through this, we slowly see the tensions between characters heightening until it comes to a point of explosion and secrets are revealed, which leads to a deeply interesting revelation for Julia Roberts' character that is incredibly thought-provoking. I've rewarded After the Hunt as the top film of 2025 because it got me excited that this may be the first step forward out of a culture that sucks all the enjoyment out of exploring difficult or controversial terrain because we're being bullied by activists who only want film to serve as a vehicle of promoting positive social values and effectively becoming another form of social engineering. Sadly, that's how a lot of those who claim to love cinema engage with film rather than seeing it as an art form like I do. And this is ever since politics dominated culture, the idea that everything is political. And if you're looking through that lens, that means creative decisions are seen as such. And I believe that's prevented a lot of creatives from producing daring cinema. And as someone who gets excited about storytelling that takes risks and explores the dark side of human nature, the past 10 years have been flaccid for me. That's not to say that there's not been great films in the past 10 years, but overall, cinema and art in general has played it too safe. But here comes a film that completely went against the status quo of the current makeup of the arts crowd and got back to storytelling that wasn't restrained from exploring uncomfortable storylines, nor did it feel as though it was being influenced by the need to project a positive conclusion of the world we live in. I won't pretend the film is perfect. Many have criticised it for various faults. However, the only fault I had was a peculiar character decision to hide a photograph underneath a bathroom sink. But that's not something that should distract from the strengths of this film. And one of the major strengths that this film has is being handled by the best care of hands possible in this day and age, which is Luca Guadagnino, who is the best director currently active this decade, in my opinion. He gave us Challengers and Queer in 2024, which were both outstanding, and now he gives us this. And this is a guy who's on a roll at the minute, and I'm very much looking forward to the future contributions of cinema that we're going to be treated with. I believe his next is going to be his exciting adaptation of Bret Easton Ellis's American Psycho, and I hope it stays loyal to the full extent of the brutality and violence that's in the novel. And because he had the courage to go into the areas that he did with this film, it gives me hope that he's going to go to that full extent when he tackles Bret Easton Ellis's source material. Now, before we say goodbye, some of you are probably wondering why this list didn't contain what have been called the best of the generation and the greatest of the year, which are One Battle After Another, Marty Supreme, and Sinners. I didn't like Sinners very much at all. I think someone thought of a cool concept but struggled to create an engaging story around that concept. But One Battle After Another and Marty Supreme, they're not bad films at all. They're made with high competence. I think One Battle After Another demonstrated the mastery that Paul Thomas Anderson has built throughout his entire career, and he is one of the most competent directors of our time. Does that mean it's a good film? No. The plot was cool. It was certainly interesting, but my problem was I didn't give a shit about any of the characters. And because of that, there was no emotion for me at all. At all. And my issue with Marty Supreme is the characters in that film were a heck of a lot more interesting than those in One Battle After Another. but the film didn't really explore anything interesting to me. The themes and the subject matters were there, but they weren't interesting. And, you know, Timothée Chalamet's performance is great. Gwyneth Paltrow was also great in the film. The film had great performances. But to get back to the main point, people have been calling that film and the other two films as generational masterpieces. And I honestly believe that people are losing their shit because they've been deprived of the heights of great cinema for the last 10 years. So when something that comes along that's filmed with competence in your generation, you get all excited and swept up in the social contagion and mistaking these titles as what will go down in history as the greats. But Marty Supreme won't be talked about past 2026, nor will One Battle After Another. They aren't bad films, they're just not generational masterpieces. And there's nothing wrong with acknowledging the art form has suffered a blow, and it sucks that unfortunately we're currently living in a time when cinema isn't exciting. But weak culture produces weak art, and let's see how long it'll take to get out of it. But we will get out of it. But this has truly been the worst year in cinema that I've witnessed.